The Second American Civil War. 2028 to 2033. By the autumn of 2028, the United States had become a country divided not merely by elections or party loyalties, but by fundamentally incompatible ideas about law, federalism, human life, and the future of the republic. Abortion stood at the center of the crisis. For years, states had moved in opposite directions. Some enacted increasingly expansive abortion protections, while others prohibited most abortions and defined unborn children as persons deserving legal protection. Conflicts between state governments and Washington intensified as each side accused the other of attempting to impose its policies beyond its own borders. Court decisions, federal legislation, interstate disputes, and competing claims of constitutional authority transformed abortion from one of many national controversies into the issue around which the country's political order began to fracture. The presidential election of November 2028 brought the crisis to its breaking point. Republican candidate J.D. Vance, an opponent of expanding abortion rights into states that had prohibited the procedure, won the presidency. His victory convinced many leaders in the south-central United States that the federal government would soon move decisively against abortion rights protections and against states attempting to resist a new national direction. Texas acted before Vance could even take office. In December 2028, the Texas government formally declared that the state had withdrawn from the United States. The movement quickly became known simply as Texit. The response from Washington was immediate and uncompromising. The federal government rejected the legality of secession, and continued to regard Texas as a state in rebellion rather than an independent nation. Federal military installations remained under United States control, creating isolated islands of federal authority within territory increasingly dominated by the Texas government. Texas did not remain alone for long. Between January and February 2029, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee announced their own withdrawals from the Union. Delegates from the seceding states assembled in Austin in February and created a new government called the American Confederation of States. Austin became its capital. Texas Governor Greg Abbott was chosen as president of the Confederation. The new government claimed that the states retained the sovereign authority to withdraw from a federal union that no longer respected their constitutional independence. Washington rejected that argument completely. To the Vance administration, there could be no constitutional mechanism allowing a state to dissolve the United States simply because it rejected the result of an election or the direction of federal policy. For several weeks, both governments maneuvered cautiously. Federal troops remained at military installations throughout the seceded territory. State military organizations surrounded some of those facilities. Railroads, highways, airbases, fuel depots, armories, ports, and communications networks suddenly became strategic objectives. Neither government wanted to appear responsible for beginning the war. That restraint ended in central Texas. Shortly before dawn on April 12, 2029, batteries belonging to the Texas State Guard opened fire on United States Army garrison Fort Cavazos. The first shells crossed the darkness and exploded inside one of the largest military installations in Texas. The Second American Civil War had begun. For approximately 34 hours, Texas artillery struck selected positions around the installation, while Confederate forces isolated its entrances and prevented reinforcement. The federal garrison possessed formidable weapons, but its commanders faced a rapidly deteriorating strategic situation. Many soldiers had family members living beyond the perimeter. Supply lines were cut. Nearby roads were controlled by Texas forces. Remarkably, no soldiers were killed during the bombardment itself. Nevertheless, the political consequences were enormous. After roughly a day and a half, the United States soldiers inside Fort Cavazos surrendered. News of the surrender reached Washington almost immediately. President Vance responded by calling for troops to suppress the rebellion and restore federal authority throughout the seceded states. National Guard formations were federalized. Active duty units moved toward staging areas. Recruiting stations filled with volunteers. Aircraft dispersed to bases farther from the developing front. The American Confederation responded with mobilization of its own. Additional states soon entered the conflict. North Carolina, Kentucky, Missouri, and South Carolina joined the Confederation after fighting began, extending the rebellion from Texas and the Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic coast. Every other state remained within the federal United States. Across the country, Americans who had once believed another civil war impossible watched military convoys pass along interstate highways. Many still believed the fighting would be short. That illusion survived for 3 months. It ended outside Waco. On July 21, 2029, United States and Confederate forces collided near Waco, Texas. The battle became known as First Waco. Federal commanders expected their better-equipped formations to break through Confederate defenses and begin restoring control over central Texas. Instead, Confederate forces absorbed the initial attacks, reorganized, and struck vulnerable portions of the Federal line. The fighting lasted throughout the day. Armored vehicles burned beside highways. Artillery batteries fired from fields once used for cattle and crops. Helicopters flew casualty evacuation missions through columns of smoke. Civilian traffic disappeared from roads that had become military supply routes. By the end of the battle, the United States Army had been defeated. The Confederation celebrated First Waco as proof that its armies could survive against the overwhelming industrial and military strength of the United States. In Washington, the defeat destroyed expectations of a short rebellion. The conflict would not be settled by a single campaign. America was facing a real civil war. The year 2030 transformed the conflict. Armies grew larger. Defensive lines became deeper. Casualty lists became longer. The United States increasingly sought to divide Confederate territory rather than conquer the entire rebellion simultaneously. Interstate highways, major rivers, airports, rail junctions, military installations, and energy infrastructure became strategic objectives. One of the most important campaigns developed in Missouri. United States Army General Gregory K. Anderson emerged as one of the most aggressive federal commanders of the war. In February 2030, his forces captured Fort Leonard Wood and Whiteman Air Force Base. The victories gave the United States important bases inside Missouri and opened routes deeper into Confederate territory. Anderson continued south. On April 6 and 7, his army encountered Confederate forces near Wilson's Creek outside Springfield, Missouri. The Battle of Springfield became one of the most violent engagements of the war to that point. Infantry fought through forests, fields, roads, and suburban developments surrounding the old Wilson's Creek battlefield. Modern artillery tore apart positions located near ground where Americans had fought another civil war nearly 170 years earlier. When the battle ended, Anderson controlled the field. Springfield was another federal victory. At almost the same time, the United States struck from the sea. Federal naval forces entered the waters surrounding Houston and supported operations against Confederate defenses throughout the Houston metropolitan area. By April 2030, Houston had fallen to United States forces. The capture threatened Texas from the east and weakened the Confederation's ability to maintain uninterrupted control over the Interstate 35 corridor. Yet the Confederation was far from defeated. In the southeast, a commander was rising who would become its most dangerous general. In June 2030, General Thomas M. Swelser assumed command of the Confederate Army of the Southeast. He inherited an army threatened by increasing federal pressure but still capable of offensive operations. Swelser rapidly reorganized his forces. His soldiers strengthened defensive positions, concentrated artillery, improved logistics, and prepared to strike the federal armies threatening Austin. Between June 25 and July 1, 2030, the countryside surrounding the Confederate capital erupted into a series of engagements remembered collectively as the 7 Days Battles of Austin. United States Army General Christopher T. Donahue commanded the United States Army of Texas. Donahue's forces had advanced dangerously close to Austin. Swelser attacked. For 7 days, the two armies fought across highways, suburbs, river crossings, wooded terrain, and the approaches to the capital. Confederate forces repeatedly struck portions of the Federal Army before they could fully coordinate with one another. The fighting was costly, but the strategy worked. Donahue withdrew. Austin survived. The victory transformed Swelser into the Confederation's most celebrated military commander. he immediately sought to exploit his success. Instead of remaining on the defensive, Swelser turned northeast and prepared to carry the war into federal territory. During the late summer of 2030, Confederate columns moved toward Virginia. The invasion threatened to shift the psychological balance of the war. Until then, much of the destruction had occurred inside Confederate territory. Swelser intended to demonstrate that cities and communities loyal to Washington could suffer the same fate. Federal forces moved to intercept him. On September 17, 2030, the armies met near Danville, Virginia. The Battle of Danville lasted a single terrible day. Artillery began firing in the morning. Infantry attacks followed. Positions changed hands repeatedly. Fields disappeared beneath smoke. Medical stations overflowed. Roads became clogged with ambulances, ammunition trucks, damaged vehicles, and wounded soldiers. By nightfall, approximately 23,000 Americans had been killed, wounded, or reported missing. No other single day of the Second American Civil War would equal it. Swelser's army remained intact, but the Confederate offensive had been stopped. He withdrew south into North Carolina. For President Vance, Danville created an opportunity. The Union had survived another invasion. Now the president prepared to redefine what victory would mean. On January 1, 2031, President Vance's abortion abolition proclamation went into effect. The proclamation declared unborn children within areas still controlled by the American Confederation of States legally protected from abortion under federal authority. Its immediate reach was limited. Federal loyal states that continued to maintain abortion rights laws were not instantly transformed by the proclamation, and the administration understood that permanently abolishing abortion throughout the United States would ultimately require constitutional action. But the meaning of the war had changed. Preserving the Union remained the central constitutional objective. Abolishing abortion became a second national objective. For pro-life Americans who had previously viewed the conflict primarily as a struggle over secession, the proclamation gave the war an additional moral purpose. Volunteer enlistment increased. Pro-life organizations organized recruiting drives, medical support networks, military chaplain programs, supply campaigns, and aid for soldiers' families. Men from nearly every loyal state entered federal service. By the end of the conflict, nearly 180,000 pro-life volunteers would have served in the United States Army. The Confederation condemned the proclamation as another example of federal expansion. The war continued, and during the summer of 2031, its strategic balance changed permanently. Swelser again moved north. His army of the Southeast crossed into Virginia during the summer of 2031 with the intention of forcing a decisive battle on federal territory. General Matthew W. McFarland commanded the federal forces gathering against him. Between July 1 and July 3, the two armies fought at Charlottesville, Virginia. The Battle of Charlottesville became the largest battle of the Second American Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers maneuvered through the surrounding region. Aircraft contested the skies. Artillery struck assembly areas and supply routes. Infantry fought from prepared positions, wooded ridges, highways, university buildings, commercial districts, and suburban neighborhoods. For 3 days, Swelser attempted to break the federal line. He failed. The Confederate Army suffered devastating losses. By July 3, Swelser had no realistic choice except retreat. His surviving troops withdrew toward North Carolina. The Confederation would never again mount an invasion of federal territory on the same scale. The strategic importance of Charlottesville became even greater because of what happened the following day hundreds of miles to the west. Gregory K. Anderson had spent months driving deeper into the Confederation. Oklahoma City became one of his primary objectives. Its location made it strategically indispensable. Whoever controlled central Oklahoma controlled a vital portion of Interstate 35, one of the principal north-south transportation routes connecting Texas with the Northern Confederation. Confederate forces turned Oklahoma City into a fortified position. Anderson surrounded it. The siege dragged on as federal artillery, aircraft, engineers, and infantry steadily tightened the perimeter. On July 4, 2031, the Confederate defenders surrendered. The symbolism was unmistakable. On Independence Day, the United States flag returned to Oklahoma City. More importantly, the capture gave federal forces control over a critical section of the Interstate 35 corridor. The Confederation was effectively split. Texas and the Western Confederate territories were increasingly separated from states farther east. Anderson continued south. In November 2031, he defeated Confederate forces around Dallas. The road deeper into Texas was opening. For months after the battle, President Vance traveled to Virginia. On November 19, 2031, he arrived at Charlottesville Battlefield Cemetery, where thousands of soldiers had been buried following the summer fighting. The battlefield had become a place of national mourning. Rows of graves extended across land that only months earlier had been filled with artillery, armored vehicles, field hospitals, and infantry positions. Vance delivered a brief address. He presented the war as a test of whether the American Republic could survive armed rebellion, and whether the nation's promises of human equality could be extended to unborn Americans. He invoked the principle of government of the people, by the people, for the people, and connected the preservation of Republican government with the protection of unborn life. The speech became known as the Charlottesville Address. Its words spread throughout the country. But the armies continued fighting. By early 2032, President Vance had become increasingly dissatisfied with the lack of decisive progress in the Eastern Theater. Federal armies repeatedly won engagements but failed to destroy Swelzer's army of the Southeast. Gregory K. Anderson had demonstrated something different. He advanced. He accepted casualties that would have caused more cautious commanders to withdraw. And after every battle, he continued moving south. In March 2032, Vance placed Anderson in command of all United States armies. Anderson traveled southeast to personally oversee the campaign against Swelzer. His objective was simple in principle and horrifying in execution. The army of the Southeast had to be destroyed. The campaign began in May. The first major collision occurred in the Uhori Forest. The terrain favored defenders. Dense woods broke formations apart and limited visibility. Artillery struggled to identify targets. Small units became separated from their parent commands. Soldiers fought at close range among trees, ridges, rural roads, and improvised defensive works. Casualties mounted. Anderson continued forward. The armies fought again near Troy. Then at Garner. Each battle weakened both forces. Swelzer repeatedly withdrew before Anderson could completely surround him, leaving behind destroyed bridges, abandoned equipment, damaged roads, and exhausted rear guards. Earlier federal commanders might have halted after suffering such losses. Anderson did not. He understood that Confederate manpower was becoming increasingly difficult to replace. Every Confederate soldier lost weakened an army whose resources were already shrinking. By June 2032, Anderson had driven Swelzer toward Fayetteville. There the Confederate army stopped retreating. Both sides dug in. The siege of Fayetteville began. It would last nearly 10 months. While Anderson fought in North Carolina, another federal commander was tearing through Texas. General James P. Work led a major United States army across the state. His objective was Fort Worth. The city had become one of the Confederation's most important remaining logistical centers in northern Texas. Federal troops approached through months of grinding combat. On September 2, 2032, Fort Worth fell. The victory arrived at a crucial political moment. The United States had endured more than 3 years of war. Casualty lists reached towns and cities in every loyal state. Taxes had risen. Families were divided. Political opposition to the administration had grown. Yet victories at Charlottesville, Oklahoma City, Dallas, and Fort Worth created the appearance that Confederate defeat was finally possible. In November 2032, J.D. Vance won re-election. The government now possessed a renewed electoral mandate to finish the war. Work did not remain in Fort Worth. In November, his army turned southeast. Work's campaign from Fort Worth to Galveston became one of the most destructive operations of the war. The objective was not merely to defeat Confederate armies. It was to destroy the Confederation's ability to continue fighting. Federal troops moved across Texas in broad columns. Highways essential to military transportation were demolished. Rail facilities were wrecked. Supply depots were burned. Fuel installations and energy infrastructure supporting Confederate operations were destroyed. Farms supplying Confederate forces were seized or rendered unusable. Military factories and warehouses were demolished. Communications infrastructure was disrupted. The destruction spread across the route of advance. For civilians, the consequences were devastating. Communities already exhausted by years of war suddenly lost electricity, transportation, food distribution, employment, and access to basic services. Refugees moved toward areas they believed would remain untouched. Few places did. Works Army continued toward the Gulf Coast. On December 21, 2032, Galveston fell to United States forces. The march to the Gulf was complete. The Confederation entered 2033 with its territory divided, its infrastructure shattered, its armies depleted, and its capital increasingly threatened. Collapse had begun. Work turned northeast. In February 2033, his army entered Louisiana. Baton Rouge fell. Confederate authorities struggled to coordinate armies that could no longer reliably communicate with one another. Fuel shortages restricted movement. Rail networks had been damaged. Ammunition production declined. Desertions increased. Meanwhile, Anderson remained outside Fayetteville. The siege had become a contest of endurance. Federal trenches and fortified positions slowly moved closer to the Confederate defenses. Artillery fired daily. Aircraft attacked supply routes. Confederate soldiers survived on diminishing stocks of food and ammunition. Swelser understood what the loss of Fayetteville would mean. His army remained the principal organized Confederate force protecting the southeastern heartland. If it broke, little would stand between Federal armies and the remaining Confederate government. On April 2, 2033, the defenses finally collapsed. Swelser ordered the evacuation of Fayetteville. At almost the same time, the Confederate government abandoned Austin as Federal forces closed on the capital from the west. On April 3, United States troops entered Austin. Federal soldiers raised the American flag over government buildings that had served as the capital of the Confederation for more than 4 years. The American Confederation of States still existed on paper. As a functioning nation, it was dying. Swelser attempted to regroup the remains of his army and move westward. Anderson followed. Federal forces moved rapidly to block roads, river crossings, and possible escape routes. The Confederate army shrank as exhausted soldiers fell behind or deserted. By early April, Swelser's remaining force was surrounded near Fredericksburg, Texas. There was no realistic escape. On April 9, 2033, Thomas M. Swelser surrendered the Army of the Southeast to Gregory K. Anderson. The surrender effectively destroyed the Confederation's ability to continue the war as a coordinated national struggle. Anderson offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers were permitted to return home after laying down their weapons. Officers were allowed to retain their sidearms and horses. The purpose was no longer to destroy the men who had fought for the rebellion. The purpose was to end the rebellion itself. Columns of Confederate soldiers stacked rifles, surrendered equipment, and began walking away from the army they had served. Some returned to families they had not seen in years. Others returned to towns that no longer existed as they remembered them. The largest Confederate army was gone. The war was almost over. Then Washington was struck by tragedy. April 14, 2033, was only 5 days after Swelser's surrender. President Vance attended a movie that evening at AMC Georgetown 14 in Washington, D.C. The atmosphere in the capital had changed dramatically during the previous week. Victory appeared imminent. Austin had fallen. Swelser had surrendered. Plans for reunification and national restoration were already being discussed inside the administration. Security around the president remained substantial, but the country was entering the dangerous period between organized warfare and peace. Confederate sympathizers remained throughout the United States. Some refused to accept defeat. One of them was Julian Banks. Banks entered the area containing Vance's reserved theater suite. He carried a firearm. Before security personnel could stop him, Banks reached the president and shot him in the head. Vance was critically wounded. He was transported to the Georgetown house. Throughout the night, members of the administration, military commanders, congressional leaders, and millions of Americans waited for news. On April 15, 2033, President J.D. Vance died. The president, who had entered office facing secession, led the country through 4 years of civil war, issued the Abortion Abolition Proclamation, and lived long enough to see the principal Confederate Army surrender, did not live to see the formal end of the conflict. Vice President Tim Scott became President of the United States. The transition occurred while Confederate armies remained in the field. Scott inherited a victorious but wounded country. His first task was to finish the war. His second would be far more difficult. He would have to reunite it. After Fredericksburg, Confederate resistance collapsed rapidly. General Thomas H. Mancino still commanded a significant Confederate army in Arkansas. Federal forces under James P. Work moved against him. On April 26, 2033, Mancino surrendered near Little Rock Union Station. More Confederate commands followed during May. Others held out into June. Some surrendered entire units. Others simply dissolved as soldiers abandoned their positions and returned home. On June 23, Confederate General Brent W. Wright surrendered in Oklahoma. He was among the last major Confederate commanders still operating. Organized resistance had effectively ended. The Second American Civil War was over. The war had lasted from April 12, 2029, until the summer of 2033. Its destruction extended across a vast portion of the United States. Texas had suffered enormously. So had Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, North Carolina, Virginia, and other states that had become major theaters of combat. Cities had been bombarded. Highways had been cratered. Bridges had been destroyed. Railways were unusable. Power infrastructure lay damaged. Military bases had changed hands repeatedly. Factories had closed. Farms had been abandoned. Millions of civilians had experienced displacement, shortages, unemployment, or the loss of family members. Hundreds of thousands of United States and Confederate soldiers died from combat wounds, disease, accidents, and the harsh conditions of prolonged military service. Many more returned home permanently injured. The Second American War became the deadliest conflict in American history. Nearly every community possessed graves from the war. Entire generations carried its memory. Yet the United States survived. The American Confederation of States disappeared. The states that had attempted to leave the Union remained states of the United States. The constitutional question of secession had been answered through 4 years of bloodshed. Another question remained. The political issue that had helped tear the country apart had not disappeared with the Confederate armies. Congress and the states now confronted the constitutional status of abortion itself. The debate culminated late in 2033. On December 6, 2033, the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. It became known as the Human Life Amendment. The amendment permanently abolished abortion throughout the United States and established constitutional protection for unborn Americans. The policy begun during wartime through the Abortion Abolition Proclamation had become part of the Constitution. For supporters of the amendment, ratification represented the completion of a transformation that had begun during the darkest years of the war. For a country exhausted by violence, however, constitutional victory did not erase the enormous task ahead. The United States had been preserved. It had not yet been restored. The period beginning in 2033 became known as National Restoration. Federal authorities faced problems almost beyond calculation. The former Confederate states required physical reconstruction. Roads had to be rebuilt. Rail networks had to be restored. Electrical grids needed repair. Ports had to reopen. Farms had to resume production. Veterans needed medical care. Widows and orphaned children required assistance. Refugees needed homes. Millions of former Confederate citizens had to be reintegrated into political life. State governments had to be reorganized under federal authority. Questions of loyalty, amnesty, prosecution, civil rights, property, military occupation, and political representation divided Washington. There was also the question of memory. Federal soldiers had fought to preserve the United States and, after 2031, under a government committed to abolishing abortion. Confederate soldiers had fought for governments that claimed the right to secede. Families on both sides buried their dead beneath the same American soil. Victory could determine which government survived. It could not restore the lives that had been lost. By the end of 2033, the artillery was largely silent. Armored columns no longer moved toward battlefields. The enormous armies raised during the war began returning home. United States flags again flew from government buildings across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, and South Carolina. But the landscape still carried the evidence of what had happened. Destroyed bridges crossed empty rivers. Abandoned fighting positions remained beside highways. Burned vehicles rusted in fields. Temporary military cemeteries became permanent national burial grounds. Children grew up knowing fathers they could remember only from photographs. Veterans returned to towns forever associated with battles they had survived. Waco, Springfield, Austin, Danville, Charlottesville, Oklahoma City, Dallas, the Uhori Forest, Troy, Garner, Fayetteville, Fort Worth, Galveston, Baton Rouge, Fredericksburg. The names became part of American history. The generation that survived the Second American Civil War inherited a country preserved at an almost unimaginable price. The Confederation was gone. The Union remained. Abortion had been constitutionally abolished. Yet the question confronting the survivors was no longer whether the United States would continue to exist. It was what kind of United States would emerge from the ruins. Reconstruction of roads and cities could be measured in concrete, steel, money, and years. Reconstruction of trust could not. The armies had settled the question of whether the Republic would remain one nation. National restoration would determine whether it could become one people again.